growing up, you see a lot in like TV shows, like, oh, that person's sitting by themselves, they must be weird, they must be a loser, which is not true. And I think just like growing up under that impression is maybe why some people feel obligated to not feel lonely. Hello, we're back for season 2. Welcome to Adulthood Pending podcast. I'm Annalise.
I'm Brittany. And I'm Kimmy.
We're a podcast for college students, recent graduates, or anyone else who's also figuring out that being an adult isn't as simple as it's made out to be. Join us each episode as we share how we're navigating our careers, post-grad lives, and the whole adulting experience.
To start off today's episode, something that's probably related to loneliness is your personality. So whether or not you're introverted or extroverted. So what are you two? And what does that look like in your life?
So when I took the Myers-Briggs for where it tells you, part of this tells you if you're introvert or extrovert, I was right on the line of introvert versus extrovert. I think it was literally like 49-51.
Oh.
And I was 51 for introvert, because I think I really like I can be super tired or like just like not feeling it, but then if I'm around like particularly people I like my friends and stuff, like I'll just have so much energy and like I can like go on for a while. But it really depends on the situation too, because there are some instances where I'm around people I don't know and I'll still be able to like thrive and, you know, get by. But then there's some times where I'm like in a whole group where I don't know anyone either, and I'll be like, I just want to go home and lay down. So I think it's very situation based.
Yeah, I feel like I'm the same. So back in, I take the Myers-Briggs test like periodically sometimes, 'cause I'm just curious to see how it changes. But back in high school and for the most part of college, I was very heavily extrovert. And then I think I took it again like after graduating, and I was an introvert. And I remember telling Kimmy, and she just did not believe me. She was like, "You're lying." But I think it is true. Yeah, I think it has like become true over time. Like I think there are definitely times where after I hang out with a group of people, I'm just exhausted. Like I'm so tired. I just need to be by myself. And I think maybe that's why I'm more introverted now than extroverted, whereas before I constantly wanted to be around people. So I think that's maybe the change. That said, I do still like I still enjoy hanging out with people, and I really like to do that a lot, but there are occasions where I just need a day by myself.
You feel tired even if it's like your group of friends that you know pretty well?
Yeah, I think it's just like if we do, it depends on what we do. Like if we're out like all night for like a whole weekend, I'm obviously exhausted maybe for another reason. But or like I think it depends on the people I'm with. Like if everyone I'm around is super extroverted, there's just so much energy that I need a break sometimes. But if it's like a good mix of like introverts and extroverts, it's usually like it's fine for me.
Yeah, in high school and even a little bit afterwards, there was multiple like situations that I was in where I was surrounded by super extroverted people. So I didn't think that I was extroverted, even though like the Myers-Briggs test said I was. But then I went to college and I was surrounded by, I feel like most people at Scripps were pretty introverted. So then I felt like super extroverted there. But I am truly like more extroverted. Like I think my extroversion is 80%.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that just means like always wanting to be with people. Like there would be times last year when I lived in a suite and there's me and another
Not our
girl
suite.
Yeah, a different suite.
Us.
You graduated. There was another girl in the suite who was very similarly extroverted. And like there would be moments where I would just walk out of my room and she'd walk out of her room and we would just be like, where are the people? Or I would just like poke my heads into people's rooms and be like, hi, what are you doing?
Never did that with me.
Oh, because you closed your door.
Did I? I don't think I closed my door that often.
I think we're not including this, but like I definitely feel like your doors were like a sliver closed, and I peek and you just be napping. I'm like, gosh, she's just napping.
Oh, yeah, that's literally why I would do it.
So we just answered whether or not we feel like we're introverts or extroverts. But on that note, do you like being alone?
I think I do. Like, I really like having my own space and having my independence, even though I am extroverted. And I feel like it's because, like, when I'm with people, I really like devote my time to the people. So then when I'm
Mhm.
alone, it's just nice to do kind of like whatever I want, and just have that time for myself. But like to caveat this, this is me like choosing to be alone maybe for like 2 to 3 hours in a day versus
Mm.
I haven't really ever had an experience of being alone beyond traveling for like a month, which is, it's very different to live completely by yourself
Mhm.
versus to live with other people and still have some sense of, I guess, like that community when you want to, but also have
Mhm.
the luxury of being alone when you want to.
Mm. So do you think because you're an extrovert, you intentionally try to find situations where you aren't alone to like get that energy from other people? Or because you also say that you like being alone. So I guess like at the same time, even though you like being alone and doing your own things, do you then find you spend the majority of your time seeking out opportunities or situations where you are surrounded by other people?
Yeah, majority of the time I do. Even when I am alone, I'm like thinking about, okay, like who should I catch up with? Like who's someone I haven't talked to in a while. Um, because in like when there's weeks when I don't communicate with anyone outside of my like family, then I'm like, oh, this week wasn't necessarily like the best socially, but then the weeks where I like talk to someone every day, I feel very happy and fulfilled. Um, so that
Mhm.
definitely plays into just being extroverted.
Right.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I got a lot better about handling being alone. At first, I think I would only like it if it were like my choice to be alone, like if I had the option to, but
Mm.
maybe I chose to take some time to like do my own thing for a bit.
Mhm.
Whereas now I think a lot of my time alone is not voluntary. Like
Mm.
before when I was at work, um like our lunch schedules like wouldn't align with each other, so I was always
Mm.
like eating by myself in the courtyard or my building. And so from that I think I learned to appreciate being alone, because I think the biggest thing I didn't like from it was like the pressure of people thinking I didn't have friends or like
Mm.
Mm.
a strong circle around me when, at work, when there's literally no one who has the same lunch schedule as me, like that's just out of my hands. So, yeah, I think I'm kind of getting over that like negativity about pressures of having to have a lot of friends and like being around people all the time.
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's interesting because the three of us have had that experience of all living together. And Annalise and I
Mhm.
are very extroverted. Like we would just hang out in our living room and be like, who's there? And just like want to socialize with people. Where sometimes Britt would just come home and she would just close her door. And I'd be like, okay, she needs her space.
It's because she was napping. No, I'm
Yeah,
kidding.
No,
probably.
actually, that's probably it. I'm not even kidding.
But I feel like, as I mentioned earlier, like I very much identified as being an extrovert growing up, but then something towards like the end of my college career and into post grad life, I've gotten more introverted.
Mm.
And so I think I do like being alone, and like you said, Kim, like being able to do my own things. I think it's something that I like to do and like find a balance of like hanging out with friends on like certain days, but then also having like a whole day where I just do what I want to do and like
Mm,
doing things my own schedule on my own terms. And I find that that's very refreshing for me and just
mhm,
to helping me like reset everything. But at the same time, I also do like to like find situations where I am with people and like hanging out with them, So it's, for me, I think a lot of my adulthood has been finding that balance and what works out best for my life.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, even though you two are extroverts, I think you are both better at being alone than I am. Like, I like being alone, like, if I have to, like I said before, like, take a nap or just chill out by myself. But, like, you two, or at least Kimmy especially, like, is good at just being in public by yourself. Like, I remember during school,
Mhm.
you would, like, I would just see you eat lunch by yourself, like, at a table and, like, kind of just be doing work. And I always be like, oh my gosh, that's so admirable that you can sit in this courtyard and, like, be okay. So yeah, I think like a lot of my dislike for loneliness is just more from pressure from outside than my actual dislike of it.
I get that though. Like, I think the times that I did sit by myself at the dining hall, I very much like pretended to do work so that people would be like, oh, she's busy, she's doing work. That's why she's eating by herself. Even though it doesn't really matter if you eat by yourself. I don't know why we think that people will judge us.
How
Um,
mysterious she is eating by
yeah,
herself.
with her book, look at her. But
Scholar.
it's just like the dictionary that you're reading. Yeah, so it was a funny story. My New Year's resolution for 2020 was to be more comfortable with being alone. And I
Oh,
made it a goal
really?
for back in January. Who would have predicted where we would be now? But back in January, I was like, every month I'm gonna do something by myself. And then
Oh.
so it was like go to the movies by yourself or like go to a coffee
Mm-hmm.
shop by yourself, like just do things alone. Fast
Mm-hmm.
forward to now, I'm doing everything alone.
Wish came
But
true.
yep,
Look at
completed
you
my
doing all your
resolution. I
resolutions.
know. So, but I think we're also in a different situation where the three of us aren't really physically alone right now, even though we are in a
Mm-hmm.
pandemic, because we're all still with our families.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
So it's kind of tricky because I think that there is a difference between feeling alone and being alone.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling lonely and being alone, rather.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess, is there a time
Mm-hmm.
either in this past year or just in your general adulthood phase that you have felt lonely?
I think I've mentioned before, but I used to think that so I graduated in 2019, so we had a period of time where things were kind of normal and a lot of my friends were pursuing their jobs and the next phase of their life, and I was at a job where I knew it was not going to be my career. It was kind of it's just like a temporary hold for grad school, and I felt really lone even though I was seeing people all the time like patients. I lived with my
Mm-hmm.
family. I was lucky enough to have a few friends that were still in my hometown. I felt pretty lonely in that I felt like no one really understood like the phase I was going through and like how difficult it was to
Mm-hmm.
be in an intermediate period where um like I didn't know what was going to happen with my life and
Mm-hmm.
um yeah, I felt really that was like no one kind of understood. And that was when I felt probably the loneliest in that no one could people can empathize and say like, "Oh, I'm going through my own struggles and postgrad isn't as hard as or as easy as I thought it would be," but like still I felt like no one actually could understand what it felt like what I was going through. And I guess like that's hard cuz a lot of people like no one has the exact same experience as everyone else, but it's still
Mm-hmm.
kind of isolating to um, not really have many people to share the same struggles that I was going through.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like that's what's super unique about the situation that we're in right now because everyone has some like shared sense of community when
Mm.
you're like, oh, these unprecedented times, these uncertainties, you know what I'm saying? So I understand your perspective when things were very normal and feeling like just things were happening that weren't necessarily happening to you.
Hmm.
Um, but I feel like for my class, just because so many of us are in the same situation of like graduating
Mm.
and not having a job, or graduating and still being at home.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, like, I feel like, even though I don't have a full-time job yet, where like others of my friends do have, it doesn't necessarily feel like I'm alone because I know other people are still
Mm.
in this same situation.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess it's just given that we are still in a pandemic here in the States,
Mm-hmm.
or everywhere, sorry, but we're still in quarantine heavily in the States.
Mm-hmm.
Um, there is a sense of like, oh, we're all kind of not, well, we're all in quarantine, so we all have like that similar feeling
Mm-hmm.
of being lonely.
Mm-hmm.
But Brittany, you bring up a good point of, or an interesting perspective of what it felt like to be lonely when you were still surrounded by a lot of people physically.
Mm-hmm.
And it was hard then to feel like others were feeling the same, especially as we talked about in previous episodes, when like people are posting all the great things and that they're doing on social media. That's constantly what you're seeing, and you're thinking like, well, why am I not doing that? Or
Mm-hmm.
like they don't feel the way that I do, and it can feel pretty isolating in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So, Britt, you were saying that there were times last year and even maybe now where you felt lonely. So, I'm wondering, like, in this experience, did you feel like, oh, I have to like fill this void with people, I have to do things to fill my loneliness? Or kind of how did you go about making yourself not feel lonely? Or was this even something that you wanted to like fix or consider?
So I think I did what every young adult wants to do and try to be comfortable with my loneliness. I had I tried really hard to think about like why I felt this way, even though it didn't really make sense considering I was like always around people.
Mm,
Um, and so yeah, it just took a lot of like self-reflecting and um getting used to being by myself and like thinking trying to spin it in like a positive way, like this is a time I can like reflect and um really understand what makes me happy and kind of pursue those things without the distraction of other people or outside factors.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it's still like a journey. Like obviously sometimes there are days like I feel kind of alone, but I think um I'm really satisfied with like where I am and sustaining my own like entertainment and happiness
mm,
and not really letting outside pressures of like, oh, I have to be constantly surrounded by people and I
Mm-hmm.
constantly have to be like living this best life when it's okay to like kind of just mull in what I'm feeling and like better understanding how I could navigate those feelings.
I feel like that is completely opposite than me. Like that
Oh,
feels like
oh.
like I feel like if I even feel like a smidge of loneliness, I'm like, okay, I'll just talk to people. I'll just like go on social media and see what people are up to. Um, where I don't necessarily spend the time to like reflect
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm.
introspect. So I don't know. I just feel like that's very interesting because it's something that I wouldn't innately like turn to.
Mm. That's really interesting, Kimmy. I'm wondering, like Annalise mentioned, one of her goals was to be like better about being by herself. And
Mm-hmm.
so,
Mm-hmm.
is that something like you eventually kind of want to have as a goal for yourself? Like you said, I know you said you like being by yourself, but like kind of understanding feelings of loneliness and maybe combating that by yourself. Is that a goal you'd eventually want to have?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. It's not even something that I've really even considered until you literally asked me right
Just
now.
now.
Yeah. Live. I don't know. I just feel like I guess because of my personality
Mm,
and being
Mm.
extroverted, like the way that I see loneliness, not to anyone else at all, but to myself is like if I do feel lonely, then it's like an issue that I need to fix. So
Mhm.
then it's just like figuring out how to fix that. And I feel like that also comes with being very like problem solvery.
Mhm.
Um, so when you bring up, oh, like, do you ever just want to be lonely and see how that feels? Like, I feel like at least right now, that's not on my list because it's like, why would I make myself feel
Mm,
uncomfortable if I don't need to? Even if it
Mm.
is like
mhm,
stepping out of my comfort zone, blah, 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 you know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
But yeah.
mm.
Mhm. No, that makes sense. Not to
Yeah.
say that like people that are feeling lonely have to sit in it. I'm just no, it's just curious because for me at least, just personally, like
Hmm.
sometimes I notice like it's kind of when I do things, I know it's just to distract me, not necessarily solve the problem of um feeling lonely. And so it took a while for me to kind of get at the root of that problem. And obviously I still haven't like completely solved it, but um
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, I think it's everyone has their own idea of what it means to be lonely. And like we clearly see with the two of you, they have different ways of, I guess, coming to terms with that, whether it's like trying to reflect and think about why they do feel lonely and being okay with feeling lonely, or if it's more like
Hmm.
doing something active to not put themselves in a situation where they are lonely. And I
Mhm.
think either way is fine. I don't think that if you are or if you like to be alone, I don't think that there's a reason why you should force yourself to be around other people.
Mhm.
And the other way
Hmm.
around, like if you like to be around other people, I don't think that you should be forced to reflect on your loneliness if you ever feel it. Um, I just think that the way that we see a lot of things in society is that like you have to always be around people or you have to always have friends, and the one who's lonely is always the outcast.
Mhm.
And so I feel like that's something that growing up you see a lot in like TV shows, like, oh, that person's sitting by themselves, they
Hmm.
must be weird, they must be a loser, which is not true.
Mhm.
And I think just like
Yeah.
growing up under that impression is maybe why some people feel obligated to not feel lonely, because they equate it to that stereotype.
Mhm.
Exactly. Yeah, I definitely feel like that's an issue. Like, of course, everything is kind of a spectrum, but like, even the concept of loneliness, if you put it on like a scale of 1 through 10, I feel like when we see that in movies, we're like, okay, that's an 8. So even if you feel, or whatever arbitrary number you associate with it, but even if you feel some like smudge of loneliness, you're like, wait, is this loneliness? Because it's not that like 8 that I saw on
Right.
TV. Like, what
Mhm.
is it? I feel like I'm not loneliness because I'm not lonely because I'm surrounded by all these people. So I
Mhm.
feel like even like before when we were talking about this topic, like as podcast hosts, like I couldn't necessarily pinpoint a few certain examples because I was like attributing it to this level that like I hear people talk
Mm,
about and that I've seen represented on media. And I was like, I don't really know if I felt that way. But then thinking about it more and thinking about that there could be a scale, I was like, okay, I probably have. I just like,
right.
yeah, there's like this weird disconnect.
Mhm.
Yeah, well, we were coming up with like topics to discuss for, or like discussion points for this episode. Kimmy brought up that she was alone in Japan for some time, and even then she didn't feel lonely. And to me, and I guess also Brittany, we were shocked because we're like, you're in a foreign, like you're in a brand new country that you have never lived in before, and you don't feel lonely. But that's obviously your own personal experience. We weren't there, so we don't know. But
Mhm.
um, and it just goes to show, like everyone has their own understanding or their own relationship with being alone and being lonely. And I think that those are also very different things too, that
Mhm.
sometimes people maybe confuse or see as the same thing.
Mhm. Yeah, I think maybe one of the reasons why like I don't see it as like clear cut as Kimmy, where like if I feel lonely, then I must just talk to someone and I'll feel like
Mm,
that will resolve it, is because I mentioned earlier, like I think loneliness for me really means like connecting with people that like understand my situations to like its fullest
Mm.
extent and So yeah, even like when I was post grad and like um seeing like my friends thrive and everything, like I had them and I knew I could talk to them, but I still felt like lonely, and that like I never really wanted to, because I knew it wouldn't solve the problem because they weren't going through the same thing I was going through.
Mm,
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think that's why it's not for me, that's why I had to kind of go into this like self-reflection of like understanding my own loneliness and like coming to terms with it by myself, because I knew like that's just how I experienced it, and so it wasn't
mm,
as easy for me to like just call up someone and like not feel lonely anymore.
mm,
Mhm. Yeah. Annalise or Britt, Britt and I have shared a lot about our experiences, like being lonely, feeling alone, and
mm.
like feeling like you might have to fix it or might not. What is your stance on that, Annalise?
Great question. What is my stance? This whole time that the two of you have been like sharing, I'm like trying to think of my own personal experiences. And I was just thinking about, at the start of the pandemic when my mom, back when I was still living alone in Boston, my mom would call and she's like, oh, you should come home. You must be really lonely. And I would tell him like, I'm not lonely. Like, I don't mind this. And I think what happened was I was finding things to do to keep myself busy and to not
Mhm.
really realize that I was so alone. Like
Mhm.
I was baking a lot. I was like watching a lot of TV. I was, reading and journaling. Like I was doing a lot of things that didn't necessarily put me in a situation where I, sat there and was like, oh, I'm really alone. And
Mhm.
so because of that, I don't think I felt lonely, but I do feel lone, like even though I was alone in those situations, I didn't feel lonely, but I did feel alone. I do feel lonely when there are when I see like other people doing stuff,
Mhm.
especially like if all my friends are together and I'm not. Like I don't know if anyone really ever likes that feeling to like see all your friends hanging out except for you. So in
Do
that
they
sense, you're
invite
like,
you?
um, sometimes not.
Oh, that's a difference.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that is it. But like even if they do invite me and I say no, and then I see them like having fun later, I'm like, oh, I could have said
Mm.
yes.
Mhm.
um in those situations it's always like when it's people that I am close with and I see them like maybe it's jealousy, maybe it's being lonely. I think it's like just visually seeing them or like seeing situations that then make me realize that I'm alone make me feel lonely.
Mhm.
But if I'm like doing something where I'm not thinking about it, then I'm not really aware of it and I don't mind being physically alone in that at that moment, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Basically, if I'm not reminded that I'm alone, I'm fine. And if I'm reminded that I'm alone, then I'm not. Then I feel lonely, and whether that's like because I'm not thinking about it or whether because I'm like doing something to keep myself busy.
Mhm.
It just kind of depends on what I am in the moment realizing.
Mhm. So, um, you mentioned earlier that one of your 2020 goals was to be okay being alone. Like hearing that, do you think you really resolved that? Or okay, this is gonna sound really negative, but like, do you think you feel like you have to do all those things to like distract yourself from being alone? So like doing those things out of an obligation rather than like actually taking
Mm.
like joy in like baking by yourself or doing something by yourself for the sake of doing it alone.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I think when I do those things, I'm not doing it because I'm like, oh, I'm lonely. I want to do something. It's
Mm,
more like, oh, I want to do this, and then I do it. So I think in that sense, like I have that I do these things because it's something that I enjoy, and they happen to just like be things that I do alone.
mhm,
Um, and the whole reason of me coming up with those goals was because I wanted to feel okay being alone, and it was what we were talking about earlier about having this societal pressure where if you are alone, then there's something maybe wrong with you, which isn't true, but it was just like maybe how I think society thinks of people. So being okay with like doing things in public alone rather. So like going to the museum all by yourself, or like going to the movies all by yourself, or going to like a restaurant all by yourself. Those things were stuff that I wanted to do to basically tell myself like it's okay to be alone. But what I mentioned earlier about like baking and journaling, watching TV, those are things that I generally like to do. So it's not really, those weren't things that I intentionally sought out to not feel lonely. Those are just things that I did.
That makes sense. Yeah, as I mentioned before, I try to do those things too, where I like try to force myself to be okay being by myself. But I also wonder, I don't know how much of that is rooted in um like I genuinely just want to like self-sustain my own like happiness and whatever throughout life.
Right.
Versus like I want to prove this societal pressure wrong, or I want to just seem like I go against society and their norms of like constantly being around people.
Yeah.
Do you two any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I will say though, like the few times that I have done things alone, I'm like, oh, this is great. I don't have to care about anyone else's time but my own.
Oh, really?
Like, yeah, like going, like if you think about it, like if you want to see a movie, I mean, I haven't done it because theaters are all closed. But if I wanted to see a movie, I could just go at any time I wanted and not have to worry about anyone else's time and how other people will, how we would all meet to get there and who's gonna pay for the tickets and the food and snacks or whatever. I would just go. Yeah, like I think what I'm just thinking like those times that I would be walking by myself in Boston, I enjoyed it because I'm like, oh, I'm at my own pace, I could do whatever I want. And that I was like, oh, this is kind of nice.
No, that's good. Because when I'm out by myself, like I'm thinking of like when I go to the store or like the mall or something, and it's usually not voluntary. It's like because I have to do it by myself. Like there the whole time, I'm just like, oh my gosh, everyone's looking at me, everyone's blah blah blah. And then afterwards, I'm like, oh wow, look at me. I did that thing by myself. And it's like, no, I did not do that for my own joy. I was literally suffering the whole time. But like I forced myself to do it because I'm like, okay, like I should do it and I should take pleasure in it when I actually really don't like doing it by myself.
Interesting.
That is interesting. I feel like I'm a mix. Well, I feel like in moments when I have had to do those things by myself, I'm okay with it because I'm just like, this is more efficient. I'm just like getting everything done.
Yeah, no, that's kind of
like,
how, well,
I would rather like over the summer when I was living in a new city with like people that I didn't know super well at the time, and if I like had to go get groceries, I'd rather just wake up and do that on my own rather than like
yeah.
waiting for people. Oh, do you want to go? Okay, when?
Yeah, I totally understand that. And like even if you do go grocery shopping together, you have to wait, and then there's always stress like, oh my God, I can't find them in the aisle. Like, where are they? And so there's like there's that to worry about too. But I and it's the same with like if you go just like shopping or go to the library or whatever in general, it's or whatever you want to do alone. It's very much on your own time, and you don't have to worry about meeting up with people or like feel like you're wasting their time if you take a while. Like I take a really long time when I'm grocery shopping because I like to really look at my options.
I believe that too.
Yeah. Okay. So I would feel bad if I'm like debating between two different brands and the person's just waiting for me, you know? So I think that's why I like to do some of those things alone, because I'm like, oh, I feel like I don't want to waste people's time. But I don't think I like to go to events by myself yet. Maybe I don't know if I have to like that, but just like I think it's just like if I'm going to an event, I have to always ask like, oh, are you also going? This is like especially back in college, like, oh, you're going to this party. Oh, do you want to go together? Like, I don't know why that is. Maybe it's also a safety thing. But
yeah, I agree with that. Like, I would rather go to an event where if I'm not going with someone, at least I know that I know people there.
yeah, I think it's also like not knowing anyone there too, or like the fear of not knowing anyone. And some people are fine in those situations. Some people are very great about meeting new people. I personally am not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking of this one scene in Startup, which is a K-drama that I
Oh my
recommend.
gosh, I was just watching that last night.
And there's this one scene where the main character goes to like this networking event, and I feel like it captures the essence of being alone because she truly
Yeah.
only knows like two people there. She's sitting at the or she's standing at the table by herself, just like looking around, seeing if anyone will talk to her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Networking events scare me too. Because it's again, it's just you're in a room full of strangers and it's in a situation like it's in those types of events where you know you have to talk to people, but it's like
Mm-hmm.
all people that you don't know, and that stresses me out.
So there's the pressure of society to like not be by yourself all the time, or like being lonely as a negative thing. But I think there's also like a pressure that like if you have to do something with someone, like that's also a
Mm.
very negative thing.
There's also like when you're with people, you have to be having fun too.
Mm,
Like the pressure of like, oh, if you're in a group setting, you have to feel included and you have to feel like you're having a great time. When there have been several occasions where I'll be with people at events and I feel lonelier than I ever have because like if they're talking about something and then I or like doing a lot of inside jokes and you're just sitting there, you're just like, oh, ha ha ha.
that
And then
sounds
you just feel
horrible.
lonely.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I've never experienced that. What? Yeah, there was like a very distinct time in high school where um I didn't really have like a very I didn't have a very like what's the word? It's like
Group,
my friend group was
click,
yeah,
fight.
it was okay. I didn't really have like a group of people that I consistently hung out with. Back in Asia, the drinking age isn't 21, so we would like go to bars and stuff senior year. And I just remember there was this one time at graduation, and I was literally between two different groups of friends, but they weren't friends with each other necessarily. And I just didn't fit into either conversation. And I felt so
Mm,
lonely in that time. Um, so I think that there's also like this pressure of if you're in a group setting with people that you know that you have to feel
Mm-hmm.
included and you have to be having a good time when that's not always the case either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I felt like that way during like college orientation. Like
Mm,
it's a few days long, so you get to know some people to a certain degree, but like, you can only get so far with like 4 days worth of events
yeah.
together. And like, yeah, I felt like even though I was amongst so many folks that were like-minded and had the same kind of ambitions that I did, I felt really
mm-hmm,
that was a time I remember being really alone.
mm-hmm.
Wait, Kim, you didn't feel alone during then?
Oh no, I
She
didn't.
thrived. Oh, just
She
kidding.
No.
thrived during orientation?
No.
Oh.
I mean, I think everyone feels that way just because it's your first time
Yeah,
Mm,
surrounded by people where really no one knows each other.
right.
I mean, and you have your roommate, but you barely even know them. So you're just like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't always get easier after you graduate either. Sometimes, I mean, sometimes you do find people, but I feel like it's also hard when you do graduate, and especially if you move to a new city too. But
Mm.
that all said, I think that there are ways that you could, maybe enjoy being alone if you can, and if not, that's okay too. I feel like clearly we are not very definitive about anything we say, so you're welcome, listeners.
you can do this, but also if you want that, it's okay too.
Yep, that's our new tagline.
I mean, I feel like too, there's been like now this weird, because of the pandemic, like idealization about being alone. Like on TikTok, people are like, yeah, take yourself on a date. And then they
Yeah.
show themselves
Mm.
doing it and they're like, wow, that was amazing. So I feel like
Feel
I
refreshed.
feel
Wait, I
like
like myself.
exactly our like society because of this pandemic is shifting from, oh, that's so bad if you're being alone and you don't have any friends surrounded by you, to like, wow, look at you doing that on your own. So it'll be
Mm,
interesting to see post pandemic how
mm-hmm.
that sort of like almost new norm will stay or whether it will not like be left behind. I
Yeah,
don't
or
know.
if it will like do a full 180.
Mm-hmm.
Almost at 360.
I
I've
always
said
do
that
that.
Circle.
before.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's 2021 and we're still at home and society is all pretty much alone with their families or with their quarantine pods. So while this might not have been the year or basically the year that we have planned for ourselves, we wanted to spend this episode reflecting on what it means to feel alone and what are the differences between being alone and being lonely, even if you're surrounded by people. So we're going to be discussing that today.
So we really hope this episode resonated with all of you, whether you do feel lonely or haven't felt lonely at all. We hope we at least touched on something that you might be able to connect with. And we just want to say thank you all for listening. If you're interested in watching our podcast rather than listening to the audio, you can find us on YouTube. You can follow us at Adulthood Pending Podcast on Instagram, and all of our other socials are in the show notes. You can also send us an email to hello.adulthoodpendingpodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions, comments, or topic suggestions. And join us every other Monday for new episodes. We can't wait to share our stories and are excited you're joining us on our adulthood journey.